Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. All set? Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. My name is Patrick Walsh. I'm a senior fellow here at the Tower Center. And I want to begin by just letting you know what an honor it is to be in such an esteemed group of practitioners, of academics, of policymakers, decision makers, and students as well as the faculty here on the SMU campus. I want to congratulate the sponsors on supporting such a impactful, consequential, and relevant set of themes for today's conference. Beginning with Gordon England's presentation last night, which I thought was a terrific address. Gordon, thank you for all that you did to set the foundation for what I think will be a very interesting discussion. If you go to most national security related themed conferences, you'll find that there's typically almost a stovepipe sort of approach. In other words, we gather strategists to talk about strategy, or we'll talk about the fiscal sort of environment, or we'll bring in the operators to talk about the impact to operating forces. But rarely do we have a place in the country to go where you have this, by design, integrative approach. So the whole notion of putting together and recognizing the need to make strategy in the current budget environment that we're in is one that will make people feel uncomfortable by design, because it means that we no longer have the ability to simply close our eyes and not look at the other aspects of the ways and means to operationalize and to achieve national objectives under the umbrella of a national security strategy. So over the course of the next several hours, you, especially the students, will have a ringside seat to those discussions and that debate. You'll have the opportunity to learn insight and gain from the experience of others. Among those who have attempted to work, study, and try to resolve some of the most difficult and vexing issues in the national security environment. Previously, we had described this world and this environment as the fiscal cliff, the tipping point, or the breaking point. And now the discussion has progressed to an unlimited supply of continuing resolutions, a sequester, a budget impasse, and a national debt ceiling debate over whether $17 trillion is enough. So for the next several hours, you and I will help understand a baseline to the discussion as to why it's so critically important and why now. Our first speaker is eminently qualified to set the stage for the day. General Pete Corelli served in the Army for nearly 40 years, and he had command at every level, from platoon to corps level. He was a senior military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and he retired most recently as the Vice Chief of Staff to the Army. The reason why Pete is so well qualified to speak to the complexity of the issues is that in his day-to-day job, whether in the Army or in the Pentagon, he worked closely with civilian leaders and government on many of the issues that are before us on today's agenda. He deployed and operated in parts of the world during the Cold War and several hot wars. During a time when the understanding of what it means to have a core competency required us to stay relevant in the national security environment. And that understanding evolved and changed. And that's why Pete, who had a reputation in ranks for being one of the best trainers in the Army, is so qualified to be here today. For example, when he learned that he was going to Baghdad, he took his commanders and his staff to U.S. city councils to understand what it means to run a city. When our government bureaucracies failed to respond to the signature wounds of war, Pete pushed people in programs with a relentless, heartfelt passion. That's why Pete's here today, to set the stage in a way that frames not only the strategic issue, but also with a clear-eyed view of what the operational impact is, and never, ever losing sight of what it means to be and what the impact is to people. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Pete Corelli.
Well, this is a great honor. I am old enough to remember Senator Tower, and to be here in a place that is dedicated to his memory is indeed a great honor for me. I come at this topic from a couple of different directions. First is what I consider as an operator, as a guy who spent time leading troops in combat, but second, as the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and this idea of budget austerity kind of really hits home, because all of a sudden I went from having 160,000 folks that were working for me on a day-to-day basis to working with a $242 billion budget as the vice. And we all often talk about the fact that you got to do something like that to really kind of understand it. I had the great opportunity after 4 years in the Army to go to graduate school and then go back to the United States Military Academy and teach American government. And I knew the five-step budget process, beginning with the President's submission of his budget to Congress, and I knew how the system worked, and that's what I taught these great young cadets, 16 of them in a class. They soaked it all up and spec and dumped it, as they said in the military academy, just long enough to get it down on the piece of paper and then forget it. But after being the vice for 4 years, I threatened in the last year to go find all these aging colonels who once were my students and bring them back and say, I lied. It really doesn't work that way. And I'd like to spend a few moments throwing out some zingers that hopefully will, in fact, can be addressed as we talk through these issues today. There's a lot of talk about in Washington, D.C. that folks are not united, that you have this tremendous rift between the right and the left. But it seems that there's one area that they are in agreement on, and that is that the budget sequester is a success. I found it amazing that when I moved out to Seattle, that I mentioned the word sequester 18 months ago, and everybody would look at me like, what are you talking about? And you realize the further you get away from Washington, D.C., when many of us were preparing for the sequester, people didn't have any understanding of what it meant. And I believe that there's been a narrative that has been built over the last few months that basically says that it hasn't caused any problems. And I provide as an example of that an editorial in the Wall Street Journal simply titled, "The Budget Sequester is a Success." And it basically says the Obama spending blitz is over and the deficit is hitting below 4% of GDP. It says, and defense hawks won't be happy that at least half of the fiscal retrenchment has been due to cuts in military spending. The defense budget is on a pace to hit its lowest level as a share of GDP since the days of the post-Cold War peace dividend during the Clinton years. These deep cutbacks could be dangerous to national security, but as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were winding down, defense would have been cut under any scenario. And the Wall Street Journal goes on to say, the sequester cuts in annual budgets for the military, education, transportation, and other discretionary programs have also been an unprecedented success with none of the anticipated negative consequences. I would argue that that is absolutely false. And I think you have to get closer to the problem to understand it. So what I'd like to do in the 5 or 6 minutes I've got left is throw out some of the things as vice. I don't know if you know what the vice is. The vice is the guy, and I say this in front of Secretary England because he was kind of my boss. He was the guy I would turn to when I had real problems, because he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. But I think the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he did some fun things. The Vice does all the things the Chief doesn't want to do. And no one wants to sit down and put together a $242 billion budget. They basically want to approve the $242 billion budget. So I got into it on a day-to-day basis. My budget was $242 billion because it increased past $100 billion in 2001 to about $140 in the base budget, and it went up to $240 with the OCO, what was called OCO. Earlier on in the war, it was called supplemental funding that the military was receiving and we were receiving in order to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think one of the very first things that you have to understand is that 5-step process that I taught my students at West Point really hasn't worked since long before, almost when I was born. Since 1954, the United States Congress has passed on time 4 budgets. 4 budgets since 1954. Now, what are the results of that? The results of that are continuing resolutions, and I think Secretary England mentioned that last night. He talked about the problems with continuing resolutions. For me, it hit me in the procurement area because I had no new starts under a continuing resolution. I think what it was missed is the tremendous inefficiencies it causes. I think all of you remember the great debate over the $600 toilet seat. Well, you know, how do you have $600 toilet seats? Is it that you have a bunch of people back in Washington, D.C. that do the shopping for their family every day, but they don't they go out and buy? It's not. It's because you have tremendous inefficiencies when you're working under a continuing resolution. When you put together a budget over a 9-month period and then find that you're going into a continuing resolution, those inefficiencies are huge. I began a program when I was vice called Capability Portfolio Reviews, where we would sit down and look at pieces to see if it all made sense. The Army does this in 7 different section groups, putting together a budget we call the POM process, to put this together. And I found when I was looking at precision munitions that because launchers and missiles were handled in 2 different areas and the cuts had been made in order to get in under a continuing resolution, that I was about ready over a 5-year period to buy 276 launchers and 100 missiles to go on those 276 launchers. The really funny thing that always brings a smile to my face is thinking about the poor officers that found that out the night before they had to brief me. God, what are we going to tell him? How can we explain this fact? But when you really dug into it, you realized it was very, very explainable. And one of the reasons is because of our failure to pass a budget. The next point I would make is DOD has discretionary authority over only a fraction of the defense budget. And I think that is what is so difficult about these cuts. Personnel cuts are easy, but I will tell you the hardest thing to cut, at least it was in the Army, is a program that was delivering the way it was supposed to deliver. I had that experience with Humvees. Not long after becoming vice, I was asked to sign a piece of paper that said we were going to go ahead and buy 40,000 more Humvees. I said, before I sign this piece of paper, I'd like to know where we are on our acquisition objective on Humvees, and I found out that we were already 20,000 over what we had originally said we were going to buy. In other words, we had already bought 20,000 Humvees that we, in fact, had said we did not really need, and somebody was putting a piece of paper in front of me to buy another 40,000. I said, this is crazy. They said, sir, you don't understand. We can't kill the Humvee program. Congress will not allow us to kill the Humvee program. Do you understand that the second UAW formed in the United States makes these Humvees right at the gates of Notre Dame University? And I went through about an 8 to 10 month process to finally get everybody to agree that we would stop buying Humvees because we needed no more. And I would argue that when you look at the sequester cuts, you have to remember that. It's not just going into this huge budget and being able to cut by 10%. There are only certain places that you can cut and get away with it. I think Secretary England brought up a great point yesterday. I would argue that we furlough DOD civilians because that's the only thing Congress would allow us to do. We're not allowed to let them go. So that's really how you were able to handle that problem. For the last few years, we've had a huge overseas contingency budget. Mine in the Army was somewhere in the vicinity of $100 billion to $110 billion a year, and you added that onto the base budget. I won't speak for the other services, but one of the big issues the Army has today is in the early days, we used that OCO money, or supplemental money as it was called back then, to, in fact, fund things that should have been in the base budget. And that has created a real problem today. Because when you lose that overseas contingency money because you're no longer fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, you've got to find room in a shrinking base budget to put many of the things that you should not have funded, but you funded it with OCO over time. And part of the reason you funded them with OCO over time is because you couldn't get a budget out of Congress. So all this is intertwined in a way that makes it for tremendous inefficiencies. The other thing that I bring up is that the fully burdened cost of soldiers, and I won't speak for the other services, but I will speak for soldiers, was a number that I always remembered because I had to testify 21 times in the 4 years that I was up there. And it was an easy number to remember because 10,000 soldiers rose from $1 billion, it was $1 billion a year when I became vice in 2008. So I could go up to Congress and over a FIDEP, if we cut 10,000 soldiers over the 5-year period of one of our budgets, that saved a total of $5 billion. And when you start stacking that on top, it gets to be real money. The fully burdened cost of a soldier when I left in 2012 was $1.6 billion for 10,000 soldiers. Now that's fully burdened. That is all pay and allowances, all equipment, all training, all those things that have to occur in order to get that soldier downrange, either in Iraq or Afghanistan. That total cost was estimated to be $1.6 billion for 10,000 soldiers. So when you're looking for large cuts in budgets, personnel is the place to go. I'm sitting on a commission right now called the Military Compensation and Retirement Modernization Commission, where we're looking at all those things. And I will tell you what we see, and it depends on whose numbers you look at, is that the personnel costs, almost 50% of the Department of Defense's budget is in fact in personnel costs in one way or another. So that is the good and the bad of the all-volunteer force. The good is we have an all-volunteer force. The bad is that the all-volunteer force is an extremely expensive force that is making it very, very difficult for us. And as you will see, and I will talk about later on, when you take a look at capabilities, and I will speak for the Army, that is where the real money is. And if you want to save money in the short term, that's where you have to go and go very, very quickly. Because cutting those numbers is where you can save a heck of a lot of money. So as those is kind of an intro in the 15 minutes I believe that I had, and I think I'm basically on time, I will throw those out, and hopefully throughout the day we will in fact further develop some of those thoughts. But again, I want to tell you, it's just such a great opportunity for me to be here in a place of a man who dedicated himself to public service in an institution that is preparing folks to not only be great citizens, but also to get into the public service field. So thank you very much.
Well, first, thank you very much, General Corelli. That was terrific. And thank everybody for coming this morning. It should be a very, very enlightening day. It should be a lot of very interesting discussions, and hopefully you'll take part in this as well. Some of the things really struck me from your comments, and they're absolutely on point for the discussions we're trying to have and what we're trying to do today in this conference. One thing you mentioned is this difference between the understanding of national security and budget matters within Washington and the understanding of national security and budget matters around the country. These are two very different things. In the Beltway, sequestration was a big deal and a huge and furious debate. Around most of the country, people didn't know what sequestration was. They couldn't understand it, and they frankly didn't care. So you had this very peculiar situation in which the President of the United States, in the State of the Union address, is explaining what was about to happen. Right? This is a sign that there is some disconnect between the understanding of budget matters within the Beltway and around the country in general. And part of the purpose of this conference is to overcome that disconnect, to try to extend the discussion past the Beltway to get more people involved with it. What else did you say? There's a difference between theory and reality. It was a terrific story about learning as a student and as a teacher what the actual budget process should look like in theory, and then there's doing it, which turns out to be a lot different and a lot more messy. Well, both of these things are important, theory and reality. You have to learn both. You have to think about the theoretical idea behind a rational strategic process or rational budget process, and then you have to understand the messy and gritty reality of it. If you completely leave theory aside, you'll have no understanding about what's supposed to happen. And if you ignore the nuts and bolts, you'll have no understanding of what actually happens. If you're going to be an informed strategist, somebody who's a good consumer of the news, or if you're a student, somebody who's going to go into this business in your career, you have to think about both things. What strategy should look like in theory and what implementation of strategy looks like in practice. I'm Josh Rovner. I'm the Tower Chair in International Politics and National Security here at SMU. I'm the Director of Studies at the Tower Center. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the participants on the first panel to people who know about both of these worlds, who are very serious intellectuals, people that can work in the world of theory, but two people with extensive practical government experience, two people who have been able to cross the boundary and succeed in both realms. I should say one other thing. Our fourth panelist, who is supposed to be here, was General H.R. McMaster. And here's a real-world effect of the government shutdown that we just experienced. He was supposed to be here, but he had a project that he was working on for the Chief of Staff of the Army. That project was supposed to happen weeks ago while the government was shut down. Because of the shutdown, it got kicked back to this week. And though I tried to explain that the SMU Tower Center should take priority, I just couldn't make any headway. So unfortunately, General McMaster was not able to be here, though he does send his regrets. But this is a serious thing. I mean, as you said, the ongoing budget battles and the uncertainty actually do have ripple effects and do get in the way of a lot of things we're trying to accomplish. Okay, enough of me. Let me introduce our distinguished panelist, and we will go down the line and then come back to me. Jeremy Shapiro is a visiting fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. From 2009 to 2013, he was on the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff and the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, providing strategic guidance on a variety of issues. And before that, he was research director of the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and a fellow in foreign policy studies. He has published extensively multiple books. His full bio is in your guide. I believe you also have an MIT background, if I'm not mistaken. So, no, you must be good. So Jeremy is going to talk about the future of European security. After Jeremy concludes, we will turn it over to Admiral Patrick Walsh, who you just met. Admiral Walsh, as you heard, is Senior Fellow at the Tower Center, co-director of the Program in National Security. And I should say, prior to having that job, he's had some other maybe less prestigious jobs, like being the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and being the vice CNO and the special assistant to the director of the Office of Management and Budget and a White House fellow. He did all that, and then he came to the Tower Center, and things got real. So what we will do is about 20 minutes apiece. Dr. Shapiro will talk about Europe, and Admiral Walsh will talk about East Asia. I will conclude with a discussion about the future of the Persian Gulf, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Do it from here.
Either way is fine.
Is this working? Yeah. Thanks, and thanks, Josh. That was a great introduction. I had no idea I had done any of those things. And and I'm definitely going to go back and look at some of my papers because they sound impressive. And I really appreciate being here. I appreciate you having me. It's a really good opportunity to come to a place like this and to see the work that you all are doing and to share what, insights that I can bring from my perch at Brookings and from the experience I've had in the State Department. Josh asked me to talk about the threats and the opportunities for U.S. strategy in Europe, and I have to admit that generally it sort of stinks to be the Europe guy on a panel like this. Asia is the future that we're pivoting to, and the Middle East is the basket case that dominates the headlines, and the problems and the priorities in those regions are at least reasonably clear. And I can tell you certainly from within the government that most senior official time and ink in the newspapers and elsewhere is spilt on those regions. And if experience is any guide, after this panel is over and we go to Q&A, there'll be relatively few questions on Europe. I've learned to live with that. I'm okay. Don't feel that you need to gen up a question for Europe just for me. But I want to explain to you in the course of this presentation why that might not be the best thing for you to do. Because I think, as is very often said, but very rarely acted on, urgency is not the same as importance. We pay more attention to urgent problems, but we should not lose sight of what is important and what the actual sources of our strength are. I like to make this sort of analogy of an auto station and an auto plant and a gas station. If you have an auto plant and you have a gas station and the gas station is on fire, you're naturally going to pay a lot of more attention to the gas station and putting the fire out. That makes sense. It should not make you think that the gas station is more important than your auto plant for your future. Europe is, on a certain level, our auto plant. I'll leave for an exercise who the gas station is. And, as President Obama said, Europe is the cornerstone of our engagement with the world. They are the first countries that we turn to for support and for assistance on all sorts of global problems, pretty much every global problem we have. We have with them a set of shared values that we don't have with any other part of the world. And perhaps most importantly, Europe is the heart of our alliance system through NATO and through bilateral relations with a lot of the European countries. And when I look back at the history of U.S. strength in the world, what I see is that the alliance system actually is our key American strength. It's actually what distinguishes us from previous hegemons and from a lot of the countries out there today. And I think this is particularly true in a time of budgetary austerity, that alliance becomes a key point of leverage. It's interesting to contrast this with the Soviet Union, which really didn't have the type of alliance system that we had. It had essentially an empire, not a system of alliance. Or with China today, which basically has one ally, and it's North Korea. So what the alliance means is that these countries can fight with us, as they did in Afghanistan and Libya and Iraq, and they can support us. And we see that constantly through every issue. There's also, I think, the economic weight of the partnership. The numbers get bandied about the economic importance of Asia, and it is growing, and that's, I think, an important thing, but still nearly half of the world's global GDP is between the United States and Europe, and over 25% of global trade. Another aspect of the importance of Europe, which is, I think, less well understood, is the critical strategic advantage that our bases and access to Europe provide us. We simply wouldn't be able to access a lot of the other theaters around Europe, particularly the Middle East and Africa, for future contingencies if we didn't have the very strong base infrastructure and very reliable access to those bases that we have in Europe. It's not principally about force structure in Europe. It's actually principally about bases and access, I think. So with that background in mind, what are the threats and opportunities in Europe? I think they're not of the same type as you'll probably hear from other regions. In terms of threats, there aren't any real worries about armies crossing borders or even direct immediate threats to the U.S. homeland. I could make a couple of those up if you'd want to. I do go to, and it's very useful for sort of gaining attention, but I think actually those things are not very critical. Europe is fundamentally stable, and even considering the Eurozone crisis of the last few years, I think it remains fundamentally stable. These are, at the end of the day, among the richest, most democratic and stable countries on earth. But I think that there are some real threats and some real opportunities that deserve our attention. The first threat follows directly from the point I made about importance, and that's about the erosion of the alliance. And we see lots of elements that could lead to this. The NSA scandal recently is the most recent example, but more fundamentally, the fact that U.S. priorities seem to be elsewhere, and we don't seem to be very concerned with European issues and problems. There is a fear in Europe, particularly, I think overstated, but nonetheless real, that NATO and Europe will not be as important in U.S. calculations, and that the alliance may fade essentially from neglect. This comes from all the talk about the Asia pivot, about the impending end of the NATO mission in Afghanistan, which will end at the end of 2014, which is sort of occasioning yet another round of whither NATO reflection. What is our raison d'etre? And then, of course, the general austerity and sequestration mode in the U.S. The SACIR was at Brookings earlier this week, and he said that he thought that the biggest threat to U.S. force structure in Europe was not the Asia pivot, but sequestration. I think the second big threat to the alliance is what I'm calling the rise of populism on both sides of the Atlantic. There is, throughout a lot of Europe, a rise of a sort of anti-globalization, anti-American, anti-European Union, and anti-immigration parties in a bunch of countries in Western and Eastern Europe. It's not totally dissimilar to the Tea Party here, but I think it interacts with a very different political system, and it has very different effects, and arguably is reorienting European politics away from a sort of left-right divide that we've classically understood to a sort of mainstream, non-mainstream divide. And the mainstream parties are all having to come together, essentially, to form governments against the non-mainstream parties. These non-mainstream parties they vary a lot from country to country, but they're commanding around 20% of the vote these days in a lot of key countries. So they're not capable yet of governing, but it's growing, and if they do reach a sort of 40 or 50% threshold, then obviously they're going to have to be started to take into account in governance. This, I would argue, is a threat to our shared values, as some of the similar trends are here. Conceivably, the U.S. and Europe could come together on an anti-immigration platform, but that seems a little counterintuitive. I think it's a threat, as it is here, to moderate politics, and thus to the U.S. and Europe's ability to work together. And I think that this could, not tomorrow, but eventually unravel the entire U.S. alliance system, which would do a lot more to weaken us than sequestration. The second threat from Europe is economic stagnation. There is, I think, still a very severe crisis of confidence in the European economies, much more severe than we're experiencing here. It's past the acute crisis phase of the last few years, the Eurozone crisis that sort of threatened immediate cataclysm. But the consensus prediction now among economists is that Europe is headed for a Japan-style decade of stagnation or two. And this has a lot of implications for the U.S. First of all, just generally reduced global activism by Europe. reduced, of course, defense and alliance spending, and we're seeing this already quite a bit. The defense cuts in the UK are really quite staggering by our standards, and they're currently anticipating that one of their aircraft carriers won't have planes for several years, which is confusing. And if that sounds weird to you, you know, you've got it, you've understood it. And basically, I think there's going to be a sort of extended round of navel gazing in Europe over this stuff, which is going to make it more difficult for the United States to get them to be outward-looking in the way that we want them to be. But I think that there are also opportunities to confront these problems in Europe, and I would point to two ways to do that, maybe three. The first is reconceptualizing the U.S.-European alliance for U.S. and European global priorities. For many decades, the U.S.-European alliance was about defending Europe, and I think within Europe, sometimes people still think it is. But we can't, as we try to shore up the alliance, we can't simply make it a repeat of what it was. We need to make it better for serving both U.S. and European current strategic priorities. The old alliance is sort of a very comfortable shoe, but it's not responsive to U.S. needs, frankly. It's not what the U.S. actually wants, an alliance that can defend Europe against a land invasion, which isn't in the offing. And this is true for the perspective of many Europeans as well. So this is fundamentally not just about a lack of attention or a change in values, which is what I was warning about before. Another reason that the alliance is at risk of eroding is because it's not serving needs, and this is something I think we can address. We can't address it by having, you know, the President and the Secretary of Defense visit Europe more often, or have more exercises or more troops in Europe. That's not what it's about. It's about reorienting the alliance so it fulfills the strategic needs of both sides. So what are you? What are U.S. needs? I think it's fundamentally about global problems beyond the borders of Europe. Europe has a lot of interests, capacities, and access on specific issues that can be very helpful to the United States and have been over years on Africa, the Middle East, on counterterrorism, even potentially in the Asia-Pacific. And excuse me. Europe brings legitimacy to the types of activities that the United States wants to carry out in these regions, which is one of the reasons why the U.S. always turns to Europe first. The problem for a long time has been motivating Europe to contribute to these problems. The Europeans, I think, are broadly comfortable with a system in which the U.S. provides global stability and they bear relatively little of the burden. Who wouldn't be comfortable with that? It's kind of a great deal. And that's the reason why, you know, we may think that's the reason why they are responding to their austerity problems with deep defense cuts, because they essentially believe that we will be there for them. This is what we call in the political science literature a free riding problem. And the important point about that is that it's only rational to be a free rider in a situation like this. But it will kill the alliance in a time of austerity in the United States, because essentially the United States won't be there in the way that they hope it will. I think to get over this, we have to understand how the Europeans understand the alliance. And here we need to break them down a little bit. There are, in fact, many different European views of the alliance because, of course, it's not a very unitary actor. And I have sort of three canonical views. The first is the sort of Eastern European view, represented most clearly by the Baltic states and by Poland, which really sees the alliance as a defense against Russia and as defending them in an Article 5 way from what General Breedlove described as being Georgified, which is essentially having to having to respond to Russian military threats, being extorted by Russian military threats. The second is the sort of Western European view, most prominently represented by the UK and France, but also by some Nordic countries, that wants a US partnership to enhance European global capacities. And the third is a sort of swing states, most ably represented by Germany, which sees actually very little threat from Russia, but little value in global clout as well, so is very happy with the current situation. I think that the trick for the United States to encourage more European capacity is to demonstrate that the old bargain is not on offer. And that requires actually, and counterintuitively, pulling back a little bit, without pulling out altogether, of course. It requires a very difficult balance. The key here is partnership, not just providing security. U.S. can't be a provider of security in Europe because that will take away all incentive that the Europeans have to provide for their own security, much less to assist the U.S. in outside priorities. So we also have to think about ceding responsibility, because partnership means ceding responsibility on some issues which are actually important to us, but on which we will be able to trust the Europeans, or they'll have a greater niche capacity to do this. We saw some examples of this in Libya. It was very, very difficult for the U.S. apparatus to allow Europeans to lead there, but broadly they did. We, of course, didn't do this in Afghanistan. It means a lot of consultation with Europeans, and it probably means that we can't spy on them to the same extent that we have. But maybe if we can get that back under the lid, we can. In my view, the Eastern European perspective on the alliance really does foster dependency. It reduces European incentives to provide for global stability that we provide for the global stability that we both seek, and frankly, it responds to a Russian military threat that doesn't really exist. The Western view is more in line with what I'm talking about, but it clearly needs the swing states to be effective. And so this implies a very strong focus on Germany as the sort of critical enabler of a Europe that can be useful to the United States. I think that the second opportunity in Europe is for a policy of economic integration across the Atlantic. There's not really that much that the U.S. can do directly for European economies besides provide usually unwelcome advice on how to solve their economic crises. The Germans are very, very tired of hearing the economic advice from a country that they believe started the global financial crisis. So we're going to have to, I think, move beyond frankly, I believe our advice has been good, but I take their point that they're tired of listening to it. So we're going to have to move beyond that to, I think, real actions, and that I think the best representative of that, best way to start with that is this transatlantic trade and investment partnership that you may have heard of, which is essentially a transatlantic free trade agreement, which is, as is often the case, a win-win economically in terms of generating more economic activity on both sides of the Atlantic. The estimates are that on this side of the Atlantic it could increase GDP by about 5%. On the European side, around 4.5%. When you're talking about $15 trillion, that's some serious cash. But the point I want to make here is that there's also, and I think that this isn't so much out in the press, is that there's also a very strong strategic component to transatlantic economic integration. It would help create a stronger Europe that would then be able to build the capabilities that I'm talking about and take on the responsibilities that we need them to. And it would help us set standards for the world that reflect U.S. and European values in a bunch of different markets, and that we could have a hope of getting other countries to adhere to. I won't mention the other countries, but you can guess. I think that the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is only the first step, actually, in creating a more integrated and thus more prosperous Atlantic economic zone. And it has an economic logic all its own. But importantly, I think for this audience is to understand that it has a very important strategic logic. And I think that bringing that forward is helpful for trying to build support for a project which would, of course, be domestically difficult here. So in conclusion, I'll just sort of sum up. I would say that Europe is very stable, even with the Eurozone crisis that we've seen in the last few years, but that the U.S.-European alliance remains critical to U.S. power and foreign policy as a key enabler of our global capability. So we need to tend to it, but we can't continue to treat Europeans as dependents, and that the free riding relationship needs to end, and that implies that we need to pull back some and share responsibility more. And that the keys are partnerships for solving global problems and cementing economic partnership through deeper integration. Thanks.
Thank you. Admiral Walsh.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Jeremy. If you were to look at recent news headlines, specifically interested in events that are going on in the Asia-Pacific region over the course of the past few weeks, you wouldn't go far before the topic du jour would be events that are unfolding in the East China Sea. And typically what these headlines and that method of reporting does is it draws you in to now historic disputes that have taken place, in this example, between Japan and China. The subject is over the Senkakus. The problem with doing it that way is it draws you into a discussion that's typically involving a listing of military capabilities and procurement that's taken place over the course of the past several years. And it takes you down a path that defines trends in military acquisition that we would describe in the culture of the military as order of battle. It'll take you to a conclusion that I think is very narrow. While it may be satisfying in terms of describing what is going on, it's not helpful in understanding what's fueling this and what's behind it. And I think with that, you have to take an integrative approach. So the reality of dealing in the Asia-Pacific region, whether we're talking about threats or we're talking about capabilities, is that we're dealing with the immensity of the region in a world that's very, very interconnected. National interests are not neatly confined or defined by the Westphalian system of national borders, simple geographic boundaries defined by latitude and longitude. Think of the world in 1946 and the framework that we had to work with. 51 countries. And look at where we are today, 194. There's a lot that's represented in a statement like that. It highlights, I think, something that is oftentimes overlooked, but it's had a powerful impact in the Pacific because we're talking about a region of ancient civilizations, independent movements, nationalism, and expressions of sovereign identity represented in those 194 nations that represent explosive growth really over a period of several decades. That explosive growth falls in on a rules-based system of society, a way of doing things that was set up by a framework established by those who won the war in World War II. So when we talk about the trends that we see today, my assertion here is that the real challenge that we're talking about is not the threat of a traditional military conflict, but a threat to the framework that was established by all the loss, all the treasure, and all the investment that went into World War II that laid the foundation to a world that has seen economic prosperity and success and put us on the trajectory that we are today, and recognizing that if we don't take a leadership role in now helping the world transition to a new system that is more in line with the needs of nations around the world, then there's probably more at stake than simply the sequester or the debt ceiling. Much more is at play here. And I think that's the purpose that I'd like to sort of draw your attention to. So rather than to start with the specifics of what's going on, let's try and lay the foundation to understanding what the real issues are in the Pacific. Each one of these individual nations that has grown up since 1945 can pull on nationalistic heartstrings and fuel tension in an era where economic interconnectedness, prosperity, and stability seem to settle so many scores of years gone by. These issues have been dormant for what we thought were years and years, but they've never been erased from memory, and they've never been long settled. So the span of interest that we have today is not only vast, but it's also diverse and it's complex in its own right. We begin with geography. Geography can facilitate or hinder the movement of people, of commerce, of resources. And then history. History influences national values, grievances. It fuels sovereign passion. And then there's the cultural and religious piece to it, where those values extend well beyond national horizons, depicted by coordinates or lines on a chart. All of these factors are in play in Asia Pacific, where the sea serves as the essential conduit that powers a global economic system and the cables that run underneath it that powers the financial system, which enable 90% of world trade. In real terms, the South China Sea sits at the center of these lines of communication in the Asia Pacific region. It's a region that we define as 1/2 of the Earth's surface, 15 time zones, home to the largest economies in the world, with the United States, China, and Japan, influenced by the world's largest military forces between China, Russia, India, North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. Half of the world's population and an area of evolving political and military ties, economic ties rather, increasing demand for resources and raw materials, rapid military modernization, competing national interests, and regional and international disputes. No matter what advancements the futurists predict on the horizon for the movement of energy and goods, the bulk of it is going to travel by sea, and often through areas of vulnerability and instability. In the Asia-Pacific region today, maritime considerations influence national security planning, economic exchange, and societal development more than any other location or aspect of the global environment. Here, the maritime narrative influences the largest populations, economies, and militaries. So nations that desire the capability to protect those sovereign interests, those economic interests, and ensure stability and secure those lines, those important lines of approach to their future, need maritime capability. As a result, decisions made about maritime forces directly impact the protection, the representation, and the ability of a nation to defend its sovereign interests at sea. In this region, sea power has returned to preeminence as an essential element of national power. In the Pacific century, no offense to Europe, but in the Pacific century,
We're used to it.
yeah. Sea power resumes its traditional role in the sea lines of communication as an instrument of peace, of stability, and the protector of trade and development. For the U.S. government, investments in the Navy, as well as reductions contemplated in procurement, readiness, operations, and manpower, while other governments invest in their own maritime forces, have direct and predictable consequences that call into question the ability of the United States to remain engaged in the region, to defend its interests and those of its partners. I am not aware of any other country in Asia Pacific that is reducing the size or capability of its Navy. Additionally, longstanding partners, friends, and allies in the region desire more presence rather than less because of concerns over tension and the potential for conflict. In this context, the People's Republic of China drives any discussion about state interests and national security, both regionally as well as globally. China has moved beyond a continental defense strategy, and her leaders are convinced that to defend China, it is necessary to push foreign militaries out of its near seas to the first island chain, to include the Yellow Sea, East Sea, and South China Seas. This near sea defense strategy attempts to influence and to whatever extent possible, control all military operations in adjacent seas, extending even to, and in some cases, within the territorial seas of its neighbors. This strategy attempts to redefine the taxonomy, the understanding, and the use of the high seas in terms wholly unfamiliar to a region that is home to the 10 largest and fastest growing economies and 1/3 of the global trade and transit. Today, maritime highways network and connect a regional economic juggernaut made possible by the security and stability over the past 6 decades. And to accede to this narrowly selective Chinese historic interpretation and expansive geographic claim in the South China Sea effectively makes 1,600 nautical miles of water that conforms to the shape and the extended southern Chinese coastline, subject to internal Chinese law, with sovereign territorial rights attendant to it, which is unequivocally counter to the most specific, unimpeachable axiom of the maritime commons, envisioned and practiced by nations for centuries in the form of customary international law. As China has developed the technology, equipment, and confidence to execute this strategy, it has taken actions viewed and characterized by its neighbors as overreach, a term used to describe intimidating, aggressive behavior well beyond acceptable norms, and generated the complete loss of tremendous amount of goodwill. Assertive and expansive maritime territorial claims have touched off and unleashed a potentially volatile resurgence in nationalism, historic boundary disputes, and challenged access to resources and contested economic exclusion zones that fuel tension in the region. We are witnessing the PLA growing rapidly in technical capability and industrial capacity, symbiotic with an increasingly jingoistic fervor and rhetoric. We see evidence that technical military advancements have provided fertile ground for diplomatic initiatives that challenge established U.S. government positions on resource exploration, maritime boundaries, and in other coercive ways that do not conform to international law, are antithetical to regional stability, and test globally accepted democratic principles at a time when national moods in most countries have needed to focus on domestic issues. In looking at this region over the coming decades, relatively few topics have the potential to determine substantial political, economic, and military outcomes for such a large area of the community of nations as, number 1, PRC expansion of influence, number 2, PRC near-sea defensive construct, number 3, PLA role in China's internal and external policymaking process, number 4, U.S. posture, presence, and influence in the region, and number 5, U.S. economic performance. For decades, the U.S. has focused its security responsibilities in support of the Taiwan Relations Act. Today, as a result of more than a decade of military modernization in the region, the flashpoint for misunderstanding and conflict at sea extends beyond the strait. Since there are no conventional arms control regimes or pre-established frameworks designed to manage escalation, the real possibility exists for conflict in the maritime domain that is not at the time, place, or duration of our choosing. The absence of a regime or framework to detension the region also creates the equally real probability for conflict that is regional in context, extending beyond the borders of the Taiwan Strait and involving U.S. treaty allies, regional partners, as well as multinational commercial interests. For very real strategic as well as operational reasons, we place a high premium on deterrence and conflict prevention strategies based on a tested formula of forward presence and cooperative relationships with allies. Reassurance to our allies and to our partners is a critical function of forward deployed U.S. forces. Forward presence is the face of U.S. resolve. It presents the nation with the capability and the opportunity to exercise U.S. leadership through appropriate, timely, and consequential actions. actions that are designed to address or resolve the coercive, unsafe, or unhealthy conditions that can affect economies, populations, and nations. So to move the agenda forward on this important conference, it's critical to shape the foundation to panel discussions on strategy and budget austerity and underscore why this is such an important topic now. Professor Carrie Tork, in a letter to the Financial Times, summed up the difficulty of assessing the complexity of the modern economic world through a simplistic but dated lens. I quote, "Before the advent of the supply chain, every industrial country produced its products practically from start to finish within its own borders. This is not the case in today's interconnected world, where all manufacturers use industrial components made in various countries. In the past, countries used the military to extract favorable trade from weaker parties, which produced an unfortunate yet predictable path when competition among powers over spheres of influence resulted in bloody conflict, with the losing party waiting eagerly to take revenge in the next war. The U.S. has moved from a position of strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity in its view of the important principles at stake in the Asia-Pacific region. But there are important second and third order effects as a consequence. The steps never take place in isolation. Each country, each one of our friends wants to know what it'll mean to them, especially our alliance partners. The U.S. says it will not pick sides in territorial disputes because it does not have a view, but our alliance partners have a very clear view of territorial sovereignty. How will the U.S. operationalize this new position it has taken? Many in the region want to know because they anticipate new challenges to the U.S. alliance and security pact structure in the Pacific. What is unique about considerations for discussions related to strategy and budget austerity in Asia-Pacific is that without U.S. presence and leadership, it leads to tension, escalation, and crisis management on the water. And that's why it's especially relevant for today's discussion. So why is the challenge so unique to commanders who operate across great distances with imperfect intelligence and incomplete picture and must exercise individual judgment and therefore must operate with autonomy to evaluate intent? The ability to evaluate intent is much more difficult than most people realize. At sea, commanders must evaluate radar returns, the number of ships in formation, their direction, the geometry, and deductively conclude intent, and therefore it's easy to get wrong. Caught by surprise. Not every country evaluates intent the same way. I bring to mind the DeSoto patrols in 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. I guarantee you Turner, Joy, and Maddox did not go out that morning to start a war that would take and claim the lives of 56,000 American citizens. Think of USS Pueblo or USS Liberty, bombed in 1967 by the Israelis. This is why the dialogue is so important, and we can't look at this escalating tension in the Pacific as something that's over the horizon that we don't need to worry about because it's not in our neighborhood and it's not going to reach out and touch us. We need to know the frame of reference to acknowledge history and the impact that history has today, but not allow ourselves to be trapped by it. One of our early challenges in this discussion is one of terminology that's familiar to a region and home to these fast-growing economies. Today, the maritime highways connect this network, and it's made possible because of security and stability in the region. This security and stability envisioned and practiced by nations for centuries in the form of customary international law. This is the example that the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea has brought to us. The Law of the Sea Treaty brings language that we can all subscribe to. If you think about the next time you fly into Beijing, you do not require a fighter escort. And the reason you don't require a fighter escort is the language laid down in the Chicago Treaty during World War II. It gave us the International Civil Aeronautics Organization, where there is a rules-based system on defining what's sovereign and what's international. And the language that goes into the law of the sea that we have helped write but cannot ratify is language that helps to define now a rules-based system that all would subscribe to. The Mariner Frame of Reference gives us ample opportunity to develop confidence-building measures at sea. Everyone shares risks in this environment. Therefore, they are easily developed because they're practical, tangible proposals that are readily within reach and would serve the interests of fellow mariners and create better platform for transnational challenges such as counterterrorism, fighting organized crime, illegal poaching, or trafficking. When we know each other's interests, when we're in that kind of dialogue, when we understand the language and taxonomy of a framework, we can begin to build confidence among nations. Our operational goal in the Pacific has had the intended effect to provide reassurance to the region as we concurrently focused on supporting economic growth and increasing coordination on transnational issues. Our goal as operators was to give leadership time and space to make deliberative decisions to determine how and when to advance goals in the region, how and when to develop partnerships, how and when to diffuse tension and prevent conflict, instead of thrusting the nation headfirst into crisis from strategic surprise, local actions, and activities that have become international that light off in scope and scale. So what I've just described to you is a view, and if you find that constructive, it represents the operational pieces wrapped up inside strategy. That strategy needs to exist. It needs to be codified into a budget, and it needs operational execution. So there's real need for cooperation right now and engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. While leaders continue to promote cooperative partnerships at the national level, what our discussion today brings is an actionable roadmap to achieve the articulated goals that we all subscribe to as democratic nations and a desire to help people in the region. All of us realize that without strategy and budget, these forces that I've described go unchecked and uncorrected, and the path to tension and confrontation leads to violence, to destruction, and an enmity that will last for generations. And then we all lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Walsh. I will finish up with a discussion about the Persian Gulf and the future of American interest in the Persian Gulf. I will be relatively brief so we can open it up to Q&A at the after, because these have been a couple of very provocative opening talks. 5 years ago, at this time, there were 234,851 U.S. military personnel in the Persian Gulf region. That was December of 2008. It was the peak of the U.S. presence. For students, I hope you all wrote that down. There will be a test later. Today, there's about 50,000. Only 5 years on, there's only about 50,000 U.S. military personnel in the Gulf. That's an enormous drawdown. That's just staggering in terms of the pace and scale of that reduction. And that number may go down further, depending on what happens with the so-called pivot to Asia and what happens in that region. Now, this drawdown, both the scope and pace of it, has aroused considerable fears among some academics and among some in Central Command that we're going to see a bad movie that we've seen in the past. And that movie is called the 1970s all over again. In 1971, Great Britain got out of the Gulf. Prior to 1971, Great Britain had been the naval hegemon, which basically patrolled the Gulf, provided oil security, and made sure that everything was basically stable. Well, Great Britain gets out in 1971, and things go very downhill very quickly. The 70s were a bad time. The 70s were a time of oil embargoes, a time in which local Gulf powers were using the oil weapon to coerce the West, a time of rising instability in the region, and a time in which regional powers were looking increasingly threatening and ominous. The 70s were a bad time. Remember, the 70s are the decade in which the Boston Red Sox are getting to the World Series and losing. It was a dark time. Did we really want to go back to that? Well,
everything we can to prevent it.
Exactly, and this is why I'm here today. I'm going to stop that from happening. What does this drawdown mean? Right? What does the current drawdown mean? Are we going to see that movie again? Right? What are the implications for American national security? What does it mean for the future of U.S. interests in the region? Will it lead to instability and violence? Are we looking at the bad old days all over again? Well, I have good news and bad news. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that the situation today isn't nearly as bad as the 1970s for some key reasons. From 1945 to 1971, Great Britain was able to provide the role of an external hegemon using very limited force. Right? The British had a scattering of bases in the region. They had a surprisingly small naval presence. And at peak, the British had no more than 6,000 personnel in the Gulf region. Right? And yet they were able to be the unquestioned hegemon of the Gulf for a long, long time, all the way up until the end of the 60s. How do they do this? Well, the British force was designed not to keep the region stable by having a large, fixed, permanent ground presence, but by having a force posture designed to be able to surge in quickly if necessary. They had very good intelligence in the region. They had a network of people feeding them information, and they had the skeletal infrastructure which would allow them to surge in naval and ground forces quickly if necessary. And they did this. They did this a couple of times, in 1958 and 1961, and then arguably in the end of the 60s, though it's a harder case. This was the basic British way of doing business in the Gulf, and it worked for a long time. They exercised hegemony on the cheap. How were they able to do this? How was the Royal Navy able to be the unquestioned dominant power in that region with such a small force? Well, two things were most important. The first thing was that the oil market was very, very friendly for most of this time period. Supply was abundant and demand was low. Global demand was low. Oil was cheap. It wasn't hard to get out to the markets. And while some Arab leaders thought about using the oil weapon, thought about using oil as a coercive tool against the West, even in the 1950s, they couldn't do it. There just wasn't enough demand. They couldn't use this weapon. So it was relatively easy for the British to operate. The other main thing was that the would-be regional powers in the Gulf region simply were not capable of aggressing against each other. Right? Most of them had weak and dysfunctional militaries that could not project power in the region, and they were also looking inward. So the main countries that we were concerned about were Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and they were all mostly inwardly focused. They had to deal with domestic issues first, and their militaries were struggling mightily. There wasn't really that big a threat of cross-border aggression for most of this period. Hence, the British posture was appropriate. It was small, it was not terribly provocative, and if one of the regional powers had any thought of doing something violent or aggressive, the British could surge in forces quickly. And for a long time, this worked. The problem, of course, was that everything changed in the 1970s. The two key factors changed and changed dramatically. First, the oil market, as I'm sure most of you know, changed in extraordinary ways in the late 60s and early 1970s. Demand skyrocketed. For a lot of different reasons, global demand skyrocketed. In the United States, it went up fourfold in just a few years. Right? So suddenly, there's this huge, huge thirst for oil worldwide. And the Arab leaders who had thought previously about using the oil weapon suddenly said, well, now we can actually get real about this. We might actually be able to do things like an embargo in order to put pressure on the West if they do things that we don't like. So the oil market changes in an extraordinary way, which makes life hard for the British. The other thing is the military balance changes as well. The formerly weak regional powers stop being weak. In the 1970s in Iraq, Saddam Hussein consolidates power over the Ba'ath regime, basically takes care of his internal domestic problems in the most ruthless way you can imagine, and builds a very, very powerful conventional force. He diversifies suppliers. He buys a lot from the Soviets, but he buys a lot from everybody. And he builds a technologically sophisticated, very, very dangerous-looking conventional military force. Iran also gets very, very strong, very, very fast. And in Iran's case, we are the ones that are helping them get strong. Right? We are selling the Iranians military hardware hand over a fist. So you have the two major regional powers who are getting very, very strong, beginning to think about using the oil weapon in a serious way. And under these conditions, the British could not have done anything about that. That is, had they stayed with a very small force, it would have been irrelevant. It would not have prevented the embargo of 1973. It would have not prevented the regional tension that arose in the Gulf. They simply could not have exercised the kind of power that they had in the past with that kind of force. So here's the good news. The situation today looks a lot more like the 50s than it does the 70s. Right? In both critical respects, the situation is much better today. The oil market is getting much, much better. There's a much broader diversity of suppliers, including the United States. We're drilling like gangbusters. We're extracting oil. A lot of other people are extracting oil. Middle Eastern oil is still incredibly important, especially Saudi oil for obvious reasons. But over the long term, it's going to become less important. If the current trends continue, Middle Eastern oil is going to become less important over time, which will reduce local powers' ability to use oil as a weapon or to use oil revenues to build very capable conventional forces. That brings me to the second major change, and that's the regional balance of power. It turns out that the Gulf powers, once again, are very weak. Right? Iran is under severe economic distress as a result of sanctions that have gone on for decades now. Its conventional capabilities are pathetic. It has no ability to project power in the region. It is increasingly looking like a military museum. Most of what Iran operates is 1970s vintage, that being the time that we used to sell them stuff, and it's very hard for them to operate it still. Iran has the capability to make life messy in the Persian Gulf, right, in ways that we can talk about, but it does not have the capability to aggress in the Persian Gulf, take control of large amounts of oil-producing regions, and once again threaten the international economic environment. Iraq, our other big previous threat, is obviously also a real no-kidding basket case. Right? Over a decade of civil war has put this country in a terrible position. Its conventional forces aren't worth discussing at this point. It simply has problems and has serious internal problems, but doesn't present the kind of threat to American national interest that it once did. Okay? So, can the United States safely draw down from the Persian Gulf without threatening its core interest in the Persian Gulf? Yes. It doesn't mean it should do so rapidly. It doesn't mean it should do so without thinking about future consequences, but the environment is fairly permissive. We can safely draw down, and I agree with Admiral Walsh. We can pivot to Asia and focus our attention on the consequences of a rising China. That's the good news. There is bad news. The bad news is that there are things that we simply cannot control in the Persian Gulf region and in the Middle East more broadly. We can't control domestic politics. We cannot control the internal political upheaval which is happening in a lot of these countries. If we believe that we can go in, especially with military force, and control the evolution of local politics, we are fooling ourselves. Right? And we risk the danger of being caught up in conflicts that we simply do not understand and lack the capability to fix. That's part of the bad news. We do lack some of the influence that, say, Imperial Britain had back in the day. We simply cannot do the things that we would like to. We might also have limited ability to achieve our non-proliferation objectives. Here I'm talking about Iran. The United States cares very much about not letting Iran get a nuclear weapons capability, but my own read is that Iran seems committed to at least achieving and sustaining a latent nuclear capability. That is, having the scientific and technical infrastructure which will let them go nuclear later if they so desire. And while we've done very good work up to now trying to slow down that progress, right, and have once again resumed negotiations, the outcome is never going to be fully satisfactory for the United States because Iran is committed to at least some latent nuclear capability. Okay. So we might have to learn to accept some success, if not perfect success there. Finally, in terms of our other key interest in the region, being counterterrorism, there are also limited opportunities for us. Right? Terrorism occurs for reasons that are very often outside of our control. Right? And the things that we do to go after terrorists in the region can be very useful and can be very effective. Right? Our ability to do things like counter-network operations and precise strikes against terrorists have been very effective. But once again, we should approach this with some modesty and humility, because an overreaction on the part of the United States, an endless desire to do counterterrorist operations in the Persian Gulf region may prove counterproductive if it inspires more hostility. So with that, I will close my comments with some bad news, and I will be happy to open it up to questions from the audience. And I'll moderate, so just raise your hand and please. Sir.
I'm interested in what you have to say about how the concept of national interest is defined. I take it that all three of you believe that there is a national interest for the U.S. to be engaged in your respective regions. Joshua, you seem to be a little bit more ambiguous on that point than the other two panelists were. But the concept of national interest always seems to be very difficult to define. And my question is, who gets to define it? You know, the American public goes through phases of isolationism. Congress reflects that sometimes. Presidents often, you know, with the interests of the executive branch. And I'm also wondering about the conflict that often exists between the need for cooperation overseas and the definition of sovereignty that Congress often seems to reflect, which is a very narrow one. The Admiral mentioned the law of sea and any number of treaties which the United States is involved in helping create, but then cannot end up signing. So one wonders, you know, what does that say about the concept of national interest too? Because on the one hand, we think there's a national interest in having these treaties, but then we can't actually sign up to them. So, you know, who gets to define national interest?
Well, since I'm on the panel, now why don't we all take a crack at this? It's a terrific question. You can't have strategy if you don't define your objective. You can't have grand strategy if you don't define your national interest. You're absolutely right to ask that. The problem is that the national interest is a notoriously fuzzy concept, right? And people rarely agree on precisely what the interest is beyond just the preservation of survival, right? So I'll talk a little bit about this in terms of my conception of the national interest in the Middle East, and then maybe the other panelists can chime in as well. For, I guess, running on 35 years now, official U.S. policy has declared the national interest in the Persian Gulf region being the, quote, security and stability of the Gulf region. That doesn't help. That itself is an extraordinarily broad and vague conception, which you can put anything into that. So my conception of what security and stability means is a couple of things. One is, the most important one is the free flow of oil to market. Right? The free flow of Persian Gulf oil to market is incredibly important for the international political economy for a number of reasons, and we have a clear interest in keeping the oil flowing. It is our gas station. Right? There's nothing wrong about just saying that. And we've fought more than once to keep our gas station open. So this is an important interest. Another part of the American national interest in the region has related to counterterrorism. Right? And counterterrorism is wrapped up in the issue of political stability. If there is massive political instability, we worry that will increase terrorism, and as a result, that may threaten Americans, right, and American interests. That one I'm a little more ambiguous about, because I don't know that there's that much the Americans can do that we can do with military force in terms of preventing new terrorists from arising. I think this stuff is largely driven at a local level. And finally, the last major national interest I'll mention is the non-proliferation objective. I think it's good to have some stability related to not having quick spread of nuclear weapons. That said, a modest spread of nuclear weapons is not the end of the world. We have learned to deal with countries that do get nuclear weapons, though it's not a lot of fun. We can live with that, and we shouldn't overreact to that goal. One other quick comment. You'll note what interest I left out. Those interests are promoting democracy and promoting freedom and promoting American values in the region and trying to make the rest of the region look like we do. I would like it if the region looked like we did. I like democracy. I like free markets. I like American values. But there's a real danger in aggressively pushing those upon other people. And this has been the crux of the debate, is how much do you want to add these additional interests into the more material ones that I mentioned before.
Thanks for that easy question. Look, I think that people at seminars often get very frustrated that there isn't a well-defined strategy. I've just sort of grown used to that. I mean, we're a democracy, a very fractious one. Presidents articulate this stuff all the time, but they lack the capacity to make it consistent. They also lack the capacity to really tell you the truth, because the first rule of governance is never articulate priorities, because you'll piss somebody off. And so I learned this, by the way, one time when the Deputy Secretary of State came to us and asked us and said, I want to articulate my priorities for U.S. foreign policy, and he listed all of the 5 inhabited continents. And I said to him, well, why did you leave out Antarctica? And he I was attempting to mock him. It's hard to mock people in this way. He looked at me and he sort of blinked, and then he gave 3 very coherent minutes on why we need to protect Antarctica. And this is the world in which strategy makers in Washington live. It's not politically advisable to do what Josh just did and say, well, we can take, we don't have to worry too much about counterterrorism. No politician would say that. Doesn't mean he doesn't have some of those ideas, but there's no percentage in saying it. And so we end up with a lot of confusion as to national interests and things. And I think that's inevitable. It's frankly permanent throughout our history. It's not a new phenomenon, and we can do a little bit better and a little bit worse. I mean, I tried in my presentation to define our national interests in Europe, which I thought were essentially about maintaining the alliance system, which is so helpful, and creating greater economic prosperity across the Atlantic, which is a key enabler. I left out a bunch of stuff that politicians would have been forced to put in, such as counterterrorism, actually. I also think, though, that this point that you got at about sovereignty is precisely one of these contradictions in American policy that we're going to have to start to address. We have been, as the most powerful country in the world, far and away, allowed to have a completely contradictory approach to sovereignty questions, where we essentially are the greatest violator of sovereignty throughout the world and the greatest protector of it at home. And we have a rhetoric in which we say, it's an interconnected world and all of these things are happening across borders, and so this old Westphalian notion of sovereignty doesn't work at all. We say that to countries all the time. But of course, at home, the U.S. Congress isn't remotely convinced of that argument for the United States itself, even though, in my personal view, it's also true for the United States. And so we cannot pass really any treaty. The Law of the Sea, which is a super important treaty, which every president since Reagan has wanted to pass, which, in my personal view, and I think Admiral Walsh demonstrated it very well, is deeply in the U.S. interest. The Obama administration made a huge push to pass that, got basically all of the generals to go up with the really impressive uniforms and tell the Congress that it was in our security interest. And the response essentially from a lot of the Senate was, why would we limit our sovereignty in this way? They're simply unwilling to take on limitations of sovereignty. This came even in the Disabilities Treaty, which is actually created by the United States, which which reflects already existing U.S. law, so in fact it would change nothing in the United States, and is a way of actually pushing out American concepts of how we should treat the disabled to the rest of the world, in which we had Bob Dole on the floor of the Senate attempting to get his colleagues to vote for it, and it still came nowhere close to passage. So at this point, and I think this is a very serious problem, we have, because of these sovereignty issues, we have essentially given up on treaties, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. And that gets to my point about in the European discussion about partnership. We're going to have to think of ourselves as a somewhat more normal country if we're going to be able to exercise these types of leadership in the future.
I describe a rules-based framework laid down after World War II that promotes stability, that reacts to a coercive environment, that promotes free trade and open markets. I mean, these are the reasons why we support freedom of navigation the way we do. All of these principles are embodied and wrapped up inside the law of the sea treaty. And the irony is that a violation of these principles is tantamount to something that would bring us to the brink of combat. Yet it would be based on a treaty that we have not been able to ratify. So you can imagine the conversations that take place in the Pacific as we lecture the Chinese on the proper norms of behavior, because they are signatories to the treaty. In fact, they have judges who sit on panels for arbitrating disputes, coming from us who can't seem to get this out of committee and down to the floor for a vote. What makes this more complicated when trying to define national interest is some of this is embodied not only in the existing standing alliance framework with language that's been represented in front of Congress and voted on years and years ago, but in the Pacific we have mutual defense agreements with 5 countries: Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, the Philippines. And there's very specific language that's suggesting what we're going to do on behalf of our friends. And that language, again, was passed generations ago, and our friends in the region are bringing that language up and putting it on the table. Article 5 in the Mutual Defense Agreement with Japan is the topic du jour, because that involves the Senkakus. And so this specific language is a real concern to us, because I'm not sure if all leadership is aware that they've inherited these permanent alliances or mutual defense agreements that represented in writing and with the advice and consent of the Senate the U.S. view on what national interests are. And if we're changing that, then we need to let folks know.
Well, with that, unfortunately, I do have to close. I've gotten the high sign from the powers above me. I encourage you to stick around. We have a 15-minute break, I believe.
NSA? Okay.
Well, somebody's listening. We have a 15-minute break. I encourage you to stick around, talk to the panelists. We'll reconvene, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Please join me in thanking our panelists for terrific.
Wow, Josh, we can definitely see the MIT in you.
Sorry.
I didn't hear your question. I asked my question,
What do you think?
Oh, I was like,
It
is mostly for the cameras, but that doesn't mean that it's not, that it can't have a real effect. They're going to need a pound of flesh. They're going to need some change in the way we do business, because it's a real domestic issue. So, yeah, I mean, there's agreements there to reach, but we're going to have to change the way we do business in a way that they can bring back to the people and in a way that they can verify. It sounds like, I mean, when I was looking at the president's reaction, it sounded like he was willing to do that. It's not going to require us to dismantle the whole thing, but it is going to require us to bring them a little bit into the fold than we are doing. to set some limits on it that they can be certain to adhere to.